Good evening, brothers and sisters. It's time to get started. Let's get started by taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, short mandala offerings for immeasurable prayers together. First time in English, second time Vietnamese, third time in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Từ nay cho đến ngày giác ngộ, con xin nguyện quay về nương tựa nơi Phật, Pháp và Tăng, hội chúng tối thượng, bằng sự thực hành bố thí và các hạnh tuyệt hảo ba la mật khác. Nguyện con sẽ thành Phật để làm lợi lạc cho tất cả chúng sinh. Sangye cho tăng cho kê cho nam la chẳng cho và du ta ni kiếp su chi ta kê chuyên sâu kê bên so nam kê cho la bên chư sangye rupa cho. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh có được hạnh phúc và nhân của hạnh phúc. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh thoát khỏi khổ đau và nhân của khổ đau. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh không xa lìa an lạc mà thoát khỏi khổ đau. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh an trụ trong tâm bình đẳng, không bám luyến bằng hữu, không sân hận kẻ thù. Xem trên tam chế đều hoa tăng đều ấy chủ tăng đến vật chủ trì. Xem trên tam chế đều nghèo tăng nghèo chi chủ tăng được hoa chủ trì. Xem trên tam chế đều nghèo mẹ về đều hoa tăng đều hoa chủ trì. Xem trên tam chế cha tăng ni tăng rồi tăng nom ga ne chi. This ground, anointed with perfume and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Mặt đất này được trang nghiêm với dầu thơm và trải đầy hoa, tô điểm với núi Tu Di, tứ đại bộ châu, mặt trời và mặt trăng. Con tưởng tượng nơi đây là cõi Phật và xin cúng dường. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh được an hưởng cõi tịnh độ này. Sa di phô kê trước sinh mê tô trao, lên sinh đêm em ba đi. Sangye Idam Guru Ana Mandalakam Niryataya Mi. Oh yeah. Oh, San Diego dole son doa ya dole roa ti sum meta tenge tindan da so siba kam sum segura dengam sungam sumi kam sum ko ne ka ga de roa dengam nyo yeta tru meta cheba de dala ru che te do dengam ba segura ani sungam su sam de tambu ni ba su ba chi ba tingi ji bom ne al hai ne so tele sungam ba segura. Sumi kamse sobu mebe ya tengi ji tembu chen ya doge kachi ora su mebe ene pai ne tengi ji komde sumi kamse ora sisum se shiba kamsum se sisum de ti sama de mida bare so ora ne lu lonjula so ba sama ko ne sama de mida bare se keji pan yu de ora. Thay năng ara cho mình juro rakba de ngusum to to ma do thama to to yo mare me do rab chine tambu ya ke e chima ya shar tentene kam do so sam ti rakba de to do
Mindavijine ko Machinju Tatanda Kesha Sero, Taso Bucherishin Shasarichi, Ragba de Medaba Ragba de Musum the Tower Marach. Jurode Keji Jugare, Tisamutan Mado Toto Yomara. Karesana. Lochi Nal Juaduin, Dawatuna Juaduyora, Dawatuna Juaduin, Dawsuna Juaduyora, Sumnandrin, Dawanina, Dawachina, Nimachangala. Ani ngima re ne kali jwa du ora ngazo tumbi o machine yo manu mato hobde gale lochi du de jwa du mara o ti de ko meta kwasi de ragbe meta kwa da chai meta kwasi ora ragbe meta kwa de ngara zum sum to de do mi ke ba da shewa da ne shin do so kamba da chi de so jwa ra kwa do to se ora se so meta as de ge tin tan da as de ge tin de 학벌에서 견에 루브르도 남과 쌍마이네 지글레군구라 야 학벌에서ገብ티데 तब मैं शांडो कवाडो कामडो तंदे के मारा दिनेशन गराजो शिबकम समते निमो गोंगे साशबे लेगे गोंगे 루브르도 미르샤 로 야드네 레고ंगे ते시 या लाशा तंडोशा 이다샤 젠담베다 도하리도 메다메다 샤도라 미디 미란레 케니 테그마로 then the system meta don't get in the dress. Don't get in a serious order. System don't get in it. Draw kitchen color that source. The draw Java should Sobusaba lumber, military, halike, nearly Italic. Sobusabach, the other to many I attend to Sobusabach Lansonati. Yavasida, and it did Dorson is Shivasiora. Droe kishi kala talas. Droe milikewa. Ya mineshi, ya tendulkewa, tenduneshi halekewa. O di dusta dengeshina, could degatam ganeshin duchera. Droe kishi kala talas, degala, tawaneshiris, degatabdiza, kavri kebuchi, kavri tendusha, kavri titam damanda, taburan judura, tulumedamada kwane, or dinashi. Narazo kyopen and damada panjudu dusangora. Drake kala tata source. Or the elitish on there.
So here, to begin with, from the sutras, there is a verse which says that the three worlds or the three realms are impermanent as autumn clouds. So here, the three realms of samsara, referring to the desire realm, the form, and the formless realms. So here, this is what we refer to as the three realms of samsara. There is the desire realm that has hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, and so forth. Then there are the gods of the form realm who, through having attained the first, second, third, or fourth meditative concentration, abide in these states of meditation in sort of like a divine rebirth. And then there is the even more subtle realm of the formless realm, wherein there is no coarse physical form, but through developing meditative stabilization, meditative concentration, they remain all the way up to the peak of samsara. So all of these three realms are impermanent, the abodes that we have, the enjoyments, the bodies that we are in. And so this is something that we can understand the impermanence of it on a coarse level, the kind of coarse level of impermanence where, say you plant something and it grows into a sprout and eventually that dries up and so forth. There are things like we're born and we get older and we age and we die. And so we can understand those more coarse levels of impermanence, but that moment to moment disintegration is something that we don't see, we don't really understand. So if we think about it, that there's a change within a year, that change has to happen within like 6 months. Part of that has to have happened within 6 months. And if there was a change that happened in 6 months, part of that change had to happen in 3 months. And if that change happened in 3 months, part of that had to happen in a month. And then you get to smaller and smaller increments, down to an hour, a minute, all the way down to the smallest kind of moment. And we realize that things have to change moment to moment. So the coarse level of impermanence, like aging, trees growing leaves and then drying out, and those kinds of changes, our worlds are as impermanent as autumn clouds. And the next line says that the birth and death of beings resembles scenes in a play. It's sort of like when we take on a new form, when we are born and we become a new being, and then we die, we cast off that body and take up another, and so forth. This is like kind of in a play, the way that when you're playing various characters, you would put on different costumes. So in that way, we're constantly sort of like taking up a new form, taking up a new life, and having to cast that away in a manner that resembles the way in which when someone is putting on different costumes in a play to play different characters, that's how it is. We may be a human now, we may go and take rebirth as an animal and then as a hell being or whatever it may be. But these are things where everything is impermanent. We can't sort of rely upon something as being stable and lasting.
nó vô thường như là những chúng ta đang diễn những cái trò trên sân khấu.
Rồi thì cái thế này suy sum mình đã từng biết đến rồi cái rồi cái chỉ cả là ta đã so sánh rồi rồi trên rồi nằm cái lon đó thì sao đó ta đang đang ở trong mình chỉ cái đấy vậy này à ta mi có che rồi lo cái cái đấy này thì che rồi rồi trên rồi suy sum mình đã nên cái cái rồi trên rồi nằm cái lon đó thì sao đó rồi số cái đấy mi cái sao cái đấy này 계산에 계지지 맞세 맞었네 대고 말아. 그 저거 계지를 전에 제조로요라. 그너 그제 대긴 했더니 계지를 저조가 대기 맞세 맞아가 지 대요 말아. 로에체는 남gel로한다들. 남gel로 교사선 코랑 가게 지루라. 로야 바라다 남사 코랑 가게 지루리 마도 마지부지 대시고 마도 계지지 대요 말아. 어디네 생각하죠. 세대하고 남gel로나 시리아 직계 사서는 최초에도 예를 들어도 계지지 그 만주르제 대로 지금 말와 로에체로 남gel로나 데스 근데 그런 관계 지도에서 뭐라 리서르 법주신도 연결도스 리서르보나네마 추진도위나 추대권 런도버레 맞아서 그 대지예요 말와 인가라즈 첸데 조엘 반 런도 체 조살라 다 고대에서는 치얼 봐 다녀르 유샬렌 반 로데요 말도지 대지예요 말와 첸딘도 요레스데 체 조안도네 체 조스니 치얼렘도로 자고 계지시에 마데비체 스스 시외 철판 로데요라 인디고 리서브 법주신도 연결도스 리서브 법주나시 아니 일단 저거 세부적으로만 드라마도 대체가 말을 타녀는 연결도 그랬습니다. 리서브 법주신도 연결도스야 어디죠?
So, continuing with this verse, it says that the transient lives of beings are like lightning in the sky. So here, this human life that we have, there's sort of a measure to our life. There's an extent, a length that we are going to live, but we have no sort of guarantee about how long we will live. How much we are going to remain, though, is constantly diminishing. From each moment to moment to moment, we are getting closer to death. In the way that like lightning by its very nature disintegrates, it flashes for a moment and then is gone. So too with our birth, every single moment we are sort of exhausting our life. We are consuming that life that we have and getting closer and closer to death. There's not even a moment when we sort of remain statically without changing, without moving closer to that inevitable death. So here, when we talk about this sort of life being like a flash of lightning, it's to get at the fact that it's not remaining even for a moment. And this is reiterated in the verse, in the line that says, rushing by quickly like a fast flowing stream. So this transient life is also sort of like a fast flowing stream or like a waterfall where that's constantly going down. Like once that water is there, it's not stopping in any way, but it's actually sort of running towards its destination. It's going quite fast. And so too, once we are born, basically our life is going toward that moment of death. We are sort of expending, using up our moments, moment by moment by moment. And eventually when those are exhausted. We will face death. We will not remain in this life anymore. But we are in the way that a fast-flowing mountain stream, or like a waterfall that's just moving downhill constantly and fast, we are constantly going toward death.
Sanji chumden de temba shi sung di so tambu midaba tungyawa si midaba de tambu sung do tini paru do midaba sung yore tama nyangele daga la mutela ya midaba sung are kelon samla to sa khaga de samla ta ase ani deje tamje ne jigbe cheshe na ose tama tele jigdo re da so ra oti de ko ngara zo tambu do ba tam midaba shenam made tende hijiro na yutang ji shu chen bu song za chiwa sero mitabore da se kangaside ina de samlutana ene me susuge diwa dure tene jiba meba chagora mitabore susu sambuche te de mitaba yin samgura ene deba mitaba sigra raba chena saba kunji tajeje se mitaba sanje tamadel soda saba kunji tajeje tambu namje tadonjus debe tama trewa de kewe tama chiwa yinse. Deso de medabo samlutan de so de medabo tagwaris tenge me samgura. Ani nyamdo debe chine nami jine nyamdo tanda yabu che chasa yabu dute ye sam. Te tagwaris tus te mare samgura. Te sambayane te ziring de yabu je dewe de samu kogi yore. Debe ring de yabu je dewe nimaji kaka susun doshare. Te chidi cheke yomara. Ngarazu namju madumbe se kyari kyapchi chimade ani che tronsuna ani ngoga che kyaka to ne kashe mene stato se to chen bed go tapchi chigra and tedi saya che ke ti yomara ti tedi san sorgore segara imaje kaga re yamdo de yabuji de se chambada sawa chichilia tembato se mijiba maso se sawa machi mijiba maso tunge machi te segara ani nori ne sabwe ne tara nyamdon diwe ne tara ni tombo konere de yagare chungsuna o de jigbe chejen ya samna nga jeshi ta jigmara she konere tombo dada nga shewchi sam ani golo che chima ya pombo chembu na ko kale che changa ro ka tinde yobudo te o dada nga dire de tadi jigbe chejen sam tabaris de jigmara tombo namje tadon jose ane kewe tamachiwa isuda. Sa kanga midabare namjune samlo kogu yora. Ti midabare samlo kore na ane cholam di abdu yora. Takpa che shigyu benge sundu tsendi kyangya mado. Ti tanda chi mandi kyangya samlo tanda na ane samba kyongbu chagira. Semliya to si ti midabare samlo tanda yaga yungu yora. Ti sunda midabare ke shambure yora. Ngarazo chiwa se shena. Chidam madi tete yorwa. Sula chiwa se trate kera shivri dasana madite yorwa itangzi wagirwa shangonerwa kera nagure dasani machi tike midwa kera gedo da ni machi kegri sigem kera shivri dasa chigwarwa te ye odi de sigdi apoda mare tambu tangzi wang ko medya se thongyorwa ine te samlu tan tena ani cholam juadure nangmi na da mi chi so na da ka ga na be ti che che nga nam bi ne long da bi ba ka la chu nyam sem ba ta ba ri stenge me a sam te ta te zir ga ya bu che go sam sam tu yo na ni no ka la chu nyam sem ba ya ka la chu nyam sem ba ka la nge ba yo chi gi sam de mi ta ba yin sam de su le ye ba yin na so ra 알치우냐 가면 되니 지금 되니 차바 용다한테 이거야 신자 세계 장장을 신자 제고 차부 시스템도 섬기면 그게 되게 말아 되니 차바 용다한테 시달아야 갈지 되고 신에 매셔래 시월에 시기 말아 다 매지도 야부지 깨리는 섬 그봐 매지 야부지 깨리는 다 요매 섬서지 시월에 지금 말해 남주세 받기 부여래 이번 요르 땅그레 겨마르 땅그레 메다 테르 도그레 但每次到那个面都要买的就是要不去点那卡的什么，是吧？要他们这时候地区了，
So here, this verse then is teaching impermanence, that from the moment that we are born, we are going toward death. And this is something that the Buddha taught really at the beginning. The Buddha taught this in the first turning of the wheel on the Four Noble Truths. This is the first quality or characteristic of the truth of suffering, is that things are impermanent. So that kind of... the reason for this, I mean, again, at that, we get to the point of death wherein we have to face that sort of ultimate impermanence, but we are changing moment to moment to moment. And that is, again, something that we like have a fear of when we think about death. But this really, the need to talk about impermanence is because we all have a strong natural sort of grasping at things as being permanent, as though they were lasting and stable. So again, we need to recognize this as being their actual nature, is that they change moment to moment. Things are not static or permanent. And as the Buddha taught in his first teaching, as well as in his last teaching, demonstrating passing into nirvana, that the end of sort of things going up is they're coming down. The end of something, sort of accumulation, is loss. The end of coming together is parting, and the end of birth, of being born, is dying. And so here, this is something that we should remember because it helps us to improve sort of our behavior, recognize the value of what we have in front of us. If we recognize that, say, the time that we have gathered with people is impermanent, it's not going to last, then we would really sort of act kindly, act in the best way, and value that time with those people. We see that there are like people who really are miserable due to sort of having to part with people. They almost go crazy, like pulling out their hair and so forth. But by recognizing from the beginning that the relationships that we have, the end of meeting with people will be parting, this can help us to sort of understand that this is the nature of things. And so too, it can help us like not sort of give rise to pride. Again, the highest that one may get, you're inevitably going to have to fall. So here, like someone, you know, who's a really like a big boss or something, they may end up getting really rich and powerful, but then say end up going to jail. And so here, by recognizing the impermanent nature of things, the fact that we can't really hold on to them or grasp them as permanent, this helps us to improve our conduct. If we sort of only think about things in the way that we normally do as being permanent, this is going to lead us to not recognize their actual kind of nature. So here, many, when hearing about death, that may make them uncomfortable or unhappy. But the reality is that by recognizing, yes, you will die, you are going to get sick, you're going to age, and these various things, then this will help you to change your behavior such that when you come to the time of having to die, you don't have regret. You haven't sort of squandered away your life. So really thinking about death and impermanence, the fact that nothing remains even for a moment, is to help us improve our own behavior, to get rid of those kinds of actions that are negative and non-virtuous, and instead be able to live our life in a way where there is no regret. We are all going to have to die. And this is, again, something that the Buddha emphasized both in his first teaching, well, throughout his teachings, as well as in his last kind of demonstrated teaching. So contemplating impermanence has many benefits.
Titi yung gurisan, kaya yung gurisan, na yung gurisan, tinichi gurisan, kaya wachima ya wuzi lang gurisan, samla nima tawa dangi ora. Kindi chima lepsu na koti, ta namjine samla tanga ti lepsu sam shiboji, meubro jibe tokja kuja shiboji lepsam sang jipa yung kumara, ta tiri sam, Te yong de namjine samda tire kebe sele ke gure kebe sele te yong gure samza samlu na lenge ne kota bo samlu ta de na kadu de le sun jigba da chi semla meswe ba shibu de yong yo mara sanje ke sung do te rang shin de te che ke yo mara se namje yo che ora ma to ke do gure na do gure che do te ka ga ro te le semble chen pendo yo mara sung gora bu sho sho sung do nyang ma chi sho sho se ko de nyang ra shi de ro 부서서 양을 맞추시. 부서서 양을 맞추시. 어디 이제 담지는 유로에 주제돼서 강가 유로게래서 또 시야르도 도르도 담에 용게 수지래서라. 내매번 유로에 찬이 내에 받았어. 나서면은 단도 탄다니 나서 나의 차로 랑주 타마들에 개로들어. 단도 로춘주이나 개로들 용그래서 내매 받아 랑주다. 어디 내매보다 라주다 조르바하다 소남네 요든 집에 주제돼 서고도 내매만 교회 타는 내에 받아서 랑주 교회 타는 개바에 받아서 내마들 조르바 교회 타는 그버스 빠르 그제 유나 가가서 샤제로 얼마도 기도하자 말아 냠냠 냠들어요 네 내뭐 가서 내보면 유네시 내에 받아 랑주 교회 타는 데마다 sabbe longjure de sab ke chekar ni ke tama ke sona ko so ke tama de je de ngora mo de de ka ga ngore se ani tan da de nge la sa ba saba ko nge ta je ji tambu nam je ta dong ju de be tama jo ke de ma chi wa ti shol ga chi de so do o de nam ju ne samre ne ne tambu sam dan de ma de te shi wa wa tang ji kom da shol o chi wa ya bu ri chi me da wa re sam Shima samlutan de ne yaguyora. Mida balakariya na to o te yunguri te utate yuandu tende yunguri samla so tabgudo ngene samlutana. De samluche ma da je de tang de je dus te yin sam. Ni imagine na da shibachi jo ta me de shibachi. But shibachi shenda suchi ma jo jingal chung sam simple chira. Ki kanga yo herwa ko simple che kanga yo herwa. Ti indu kar so da. Ore ta tishma da sa so ya.
So here, if we can really think about this extensively, thinking about death and impermanence is something that we need to do sort of on a daily basis. We need to habituate our mind to this regularly in order to benefit from this. We need to recognize that we are going to have to die, and we want to, therefore, get a good rebirth. If we recognize that we have to die, we are going to have to pass away, we will be concerned about what will come in the future. And therefore, if we're doing that on a regular basis, we can make effort toward that goal. So there won't be this kind of like sudden, unexpected misery and suffering, like fear, anxiety when death actually hits, because you will have been prepared. It won't become this kind of unbearable fear because it's something that you have thought about. You don't have to have this kind of fear of death if you've actually contemplated it prior to the time. And so this is the nature of things. The Buddha isn't teaching this to us in order to make us scared or something, but rather he's teaching us to show that this is really how things are. It is the nature of things that even if we are, say, healthy, the end of health is to get sick. The end of youth is old age. The end of our life is death. The end of our wealth is loss. These are things that are just the nature of things. Even when we are, say, healthy for some period of time, that doesn't remain forever. We are going to have to face disease, sickness. And even though we begin as a youth, the end of youth, what inevitably happens is that we move into old age. We can't remain, we can't stay. And no matter how much wealth one may have accumulated and gathered, it is going to be dispersed. At the time of death, you can't take that with you. You may lose it during your life. You may lose it at the end of life. but the end of life is its destruction. We can't remain. And so by thinking about this, I mean, maybe when we start to contemplate death and impermanence, there's a little bit of uncomfortable like feeling there. It makes us a little bit unhappy, but through repeated contemplation, we can actually have this kind of confidence. And we can see not just for the time of death, but really the benefit that comes from recognizing that whatever situation we are in is impermanent. If we are struggling with something or going through some kind of hardship, we can know that, oh, this will pass because it is impermanent. So seeing in that way, this contemplation of death and impermanence, although initially it may raise some sort of discomfort, is something that actually can bring us a great deal of comfort, particularly at the time of death or when we are facing some sort of hardships. So what's encapsulated in these verses of saying that everything is impermanent and that the end of life is death and so forth is to help us with that.
never came matches. Panda to the Pamadana, Shella so much, Susu Mezitoya to the Mezigia to the Chichala, the Chitosto to the so much as so. Let me rimgi says, Nico Tata Shanses Charda, Manzu Konduse, Kaga Miri in and Chisonal in and Kangana Manzu Konduse. Kagake Marwa, Kendushala, Kenanga Holy Chicken, that's Kabdi Chaya to the Keke Marwa. Kokawakine Shala, General Kene Kivaka Marwa. Lumbakawakine Kura, Lego, Kendur Mother Konga, Kirante, Gingate, Kagas, Kabdi Chaya, to the Marwa. At the end of Kura Lego, take care, Kawakine. In the Kivane. Someone to undo the Tumedua de Samsa. Draw it down, Nirim Verge. Nazuda Konzus Chata, Lumbayan and Kavena Sosukesha, Tanda Sosukesha or the Yendu the Rangetos or Tachibur Sosukesha, Ranchi, Rankesha, Sivara. The Ina Nazuda Konzus, Simja Shandalia, Yawachin, Chatan Siomara. Nazucho, Konzucho, the Chagna Pangatua. Juneti, Titapishoda, Nibatel, Sumbadella, Thabkhe Shen was all that. Toma Bevana Samataya Kaga Noshasi, Talo Kacher Storwa, Sesher Dora, Taranjan Samutan, Toma Bevana Samutan did So Geshe ni mili sawa che tende sen tanda bodo kordere ke yagare mu ta chebo jangese dakshen chesida dakshen chesala ta de shen ta che ke mara dakshen chesida nga samsa ran che ban se belo teta shen yagar do lo ni de chebo jangese da 통만 매만 타보더라 개체수 세샤스 다들 리면도 땅에 shen 심제 상만 개체수 세계스 나는 개충을 세계스 등이 집어졌네 다고 shen 집에 찬죽 셈스기도 근데 삼을 깨내니 림길로 장기 인삼 대체도니 신주를 써봐 다음에 덤벌을 써봐 근데 흉을 터바체 삼바체 고베 림기 주기 인삼 군로 세tam에 삼바슈서 근데
So, as this sutra verse says, the three worlds are impermanent as autumn clouds. The birth and death of beings resemble scenes in a play. So there's no kind of certainty. Again, the three worlds are impermanent. We are constantly subject to having to change moment to moment, and we take many different births, like the way that sort of an actor might put on different costumes within a play. So it's like we've cycled through all of the different kinds of births, from human to hell being to God and so forth. And this life that we have right now is not going to remain. Now, we need to sort of get the kind of conditions to be able to sustain ourselves, to keep ourselves alive. But anything beyond that, going far beyond that, leads to this like needing more and more and more. And then we get to a point where we're willing to engage in non-virtue to get more for ourselves. And so no matter like however much we might try to accumulate kind of virtue, it's really not helping us to get out of this situation. We're in this kind of desperate situation of like having to cycle out of our control, and no matter how much wealth we may get, we can't actually fix that. So here we should sort of expand our view to our future lives, and even if we are not at a point where we can give up a kind of self-cherishing attitude, we should think that when we have this idea of like our self, our family, our group, our society, whatever it may be, we don't necessarily, maybe we're not able to yet get rid of that kind of cherishing, but we should at least recognize that we shouldn't harm others in the course of pursuing our own needs. We shouldn't sort of physically, violently harm them. We shouldn't deceive or cheat others, because that is going to create suffering in the future. So here is that at the most basic level, we should try to benefit others. And if we can't benefit them, at least we should never do them any sort of harm. And so then we can begin in sort of stages to recognize, again, not just that we need to get rid of those sorts of harmful actions, but these attitudes of attachment and animosity are really kind of pointless. We see how it is that like we distinguish ourselves into like, oh, well, you were born in the South and I was born in the North, or whatever it may be. And we sort of find reasons to confront each other, to see differences. And really, these differences are not sort of inherent. It's due to karma that we have been born in various places. It's not as though we did so out of our own autonomy, and yet we cling to it as though we had done something. And so here, this is really, we should come to see the disadvantages of that kind of attachment and aversion, and really recognize that all of us wants to have happiness. All of us want not to suffer, and we're really all the same in this way. And so we shouldn't give in to attachment and animosity, especially when it leads us to then accumulate karma, which just perpetuates this cycle of samsara. But here, thinking even more expansively than that, we see that this kind of self-cherishing attitude that we have pursued since beginningless time is really mistaken. It is this kind of self-cherishing attitude that has led us astray, that has caused us to continue to suffer, to cycle within samsara. And so if we are able to exchange that kind of self-cherishing attitude for an attitude where we value and cherish others, then this is really how we achieve the sort of highest happiness. So when we begin to think about this, just thinking of ourselves ourselves and neglecting others, we come to see that this is really not okay. It's a totally mistaken way of thinking. And so we begin to want to work for the benefit of others. So thinking that we are in this way going to train our minds in stages, we should set a good motivation for listening to the teachings.
Kunju timbas te kandis chunga des no di shenda songe yo mara so kyo nga ma le sa shaba nyamo wang le sambu da nyamba san ti wang kyo sambu da nyamba ro te wa da tunga yung go resche kyo kunju timbas so nyamo wang sa be le nyamo ni dire so tenen go bo timbas nyamo pamba nyamo sebe seba ya tangji sebe seba chagdang sebe seba chagdang pangba te so sona ni khwale ke yo marba gogbe temba sede nyamo gogba nyamo pangba gokten se nyamo pangbe gogba ya gogbe temba nyamo sebe tera gomre kujba gogbe lamba be temba te tobje kyu de karesne tame to be lamla soba lam de res hogbe lam yala ke besura palam yala ke sugura lam de palam yala ke sugura o tire o de tinalia samutaya de la so ri pombuti mitaba samutang do mitaba da tumya samutang do eni telia tende ken te yabure medu samla tele kyu res kunju res judi pa yor bas o judi pa yor se yor das judi se ne Thabkhe ne se o lam da me ba kasa da me kombure teni chagdang yor do res teni lesa mare se do kasa da me kombulam se do o che jang o che de tende song ba de sanje song ba de tembang ne su da timba kwa jube kyunde kwa dokbe kyunde yibu de ne su da timba yin se ti so da temba shi se temba se tere ya na susu kyo ngara zu tongju na shi temba mare phagwe kansa ge sigwa na shi temba re se phagwe temba se tende se ne sungora ya ti chi so na.
So here, picking up with the text, last time we had gone through the four noble truths, beginning with the Buddha taught, this is the noble truth of suffering, or this is the truth of suffering, referring to the fact that our abode, this environment and the beings within it, all of our possessions, our body, these contaminated aggregates are in the nature of suffering, and therefore they are the truth of suffering. And then there is the truth of the origin of suffering. It is karma and the afflictions, particularly this ignorance that causes us to create karma, which then act as causes for our cycling in samsara. And then there's the truth of cessation, which is referring to the cessation that is the ceasing of afflictions, that is an extinction, that is the extinction of that karma and afflictions, the abandonment of those karma and afflictions. And this is something that one can achieve. We can achieve this kind of extinction, this extinction of karma and the afflictions through achieving the path, through practicing the path, the various methods. So here, this is sometimes referred to as like the Eightfold Noble Path, but here the truth of the path is then that which effectuates, which creates that true cessation, that elimination of our afflictions. And so here, by teaching that these aggregates are impermanent and they are in the nature of suffering, one then sees, well, if these are in the nature of suffering, how can I get out of this? How could I eliminate this? So we identify that there is a cause, the karma, and particularly our afflictions, this ignorance, are the cause that leads to our suffering. And so by eliminating that cause through, again, practicing the path, one is able to achieve a cessation of karma and afflictions, a cessation to that resulting suffering. So here, these are called the four noble truths because they are true insofar as this teaching of the Buddha accords with the way that things actually are. It is the way that things really are. Thus, it is true. And it is also called like the noble truths or truths for nobles, referring to Aryas or superior beings, because these are not things that we as ordinary beings see as true, but rather those who have had a direct realization of emptiness, Arya, superior beings, do see these as being true. And therefore, these are truths for a noble or truths for those who are able to see that, as opposed to us ordinary beings. But they are also true, again, in the sense that these are accord with reality. These series of cause and effect, or effect and cause, are actually accord with the way things are.
temple number 6 meta tunge tong mise o dezu kanga chiriba to zoge ta takbare sera pumbu to zo keji gyogi mare sera ye rambushin ma to keji gyogi mare sera takba to tinde samdwa o teacher anechi kamse ta to zo sangmare shanda zobare sera miri tinde le kudo zawa jimba misangwa sera o te tanda ngazu misangwa sera tinde le cha sore tene ya 이 껴와 집에시인배나 미상한테 되고 그래. 서진이를 pompu도 샤다 르바다 나야지 사야유 사야 그거 통해 그 마부 그거도 대고 통해 시진게를 son자 삼롱원에 다는 셈을 껴와게요서 소부데 텐데 멤버 야부지요나니 티뇨다 강가 용 말와 셈 소부네 중원에 삼을다는 셈을 껴와게 시선자 미상와서 껴와게 시나 다야 오면 두세 이제라 어tenderle kujidoa 망차 시르바가 되죠 아니 동해를 교요 동해 교가를 지지대 제밥을 제벌을 사러 텐데요라 어텐데 말을 소소소래다 니모 왕의 제벌을 텐데 티 말을 리레스 양다고 때려보고 용거라 아니 다서데 랑게트베 딱바 치부랑와 시와르세 아니 나데 시부치요 나샤는 땅지 앞에 두어라 디디 다음에 봐 시르베세 takpa chibu rangwa tende tayo mara taase taade mitakpare takwa mara se pa sungkidwa chidang kagaag chulu shendaag tidu sampo kaptenge giri chigara tosu nalya dimandinde tende mara tende re se sungku yora tende chane mambu chungkidwa tarwa me singe yora tarwa yore se nyumu sebe tarwa re se
So here, in terms of the truth of suffering, the characteristics are impermanence, suffering, empty, and selfless. And so here, these kinds of characteristics, or understanding these, is what helps to counteract the kind of mistaken apprehensions, in particular those that like non-Buddhists hold. I mean, we all have like grasping at permanence, but here there are those that assert, like with their tenets, with their philosophical schools, that there is some kind of a permanent self that is, say, maybe pure, somehow clean or pure. They see this as being as well the source of happiness and so forth. And so here, by teaching that no, the self is in fact impermanent, it is something that is in the nature of suffering. It doesn't have such a self as you assert, and it is empty of having that kind of like purity. This is now these are each have a sort of the effect of counteracting those wrong views, but they're also particularly like the one teaching that it is empty of a pure self is to give rise to a kind of revulsion. I mean, all of these to see that these contaminated, appropriated aggregates are the basis of suffering. This sort of flesh and blood that we have taken up is something that actually leads to suffering. We have a sense of like, oh, like revulsion at this, like, oh, this isn't something that is good. this is actually within the nature of suffering. So contemplating these kinds of things is to counteract those sorts of things, to help us give rise to a sense of revulsion, not grasping at our aggregate. And in terms of the sort of cause of suffering, there are those non-Buddhists that would say like, oh, a creator God of some kind gives suffering, or that is why we end up suffering. But here the Buddhists have correctly sort of determined that suffering is not given, but is rather something that arises due to karma. And again, when it comes to then the sort of assertion of non-Buddhists that there is some kind of a permanent, unitary, autonomous self, this is something that is counteracted by the Buddhists that would say there is no such sort of permanent, unitary, autonomous self in this way. And so here, the kind of assertion that non-Buddhists have, they're sort of positing of such a self is refuted through the proper understanding of the characteristic of selflessness in terms of the truth of suffering.
Tân bốc bản thân của mình thì làm tăng thêm cái ngã chấp. Trinh nói là không có cái ngã, cái tôi, cái ngã đó nó cũng là vô thường, nên đã phá cái quan điểm của ngoại đạo, họ nói không có giải thoát, nên trong khi đó đạo Phật nói
내가 내 거에 가는 게 그래서는 대신 메다서 주루세 시에도 어디 그때마다 창마가 집어시게요래 집어시에시오래 tomorrow 기내내다 다메세서 다메데 가르세 그래서는 수다바다 도대바다 셈잠바다 우마바 창마가 단다 지다 산계가 손도서 담부치어 손도 치르바서고 다 딱바예 딱바시라 요메바 다디 전 메시에 가게시에 메시래 소보디 버루 조치니 심마도 다 고런 딱바시 되그랬어요. 요 딱바시라 다디 딱바시 되그라 지구시라 딱직 차잔체요 말에 다들이야 차다 로봇 현대 계획고 말에 차시체요 말에 직장계마도 지금 그때 참여해서도 그런 직장계 지기랑 주통계시월마도 그걸 아주 남부에서는 시다들 풍부가요 그래서 풍부리아 차시만부요 그래서 때려요 말에 차요 말에 그런 직장계 참여게 집으서라 딱 찍으서라 라와제 그런 수질 풍부를 떼고 말은 가라서는 풍부를 떼지 델바 조세라 수질 떼지 델고 말은 그거라 코로나 배 랑수chen 딱바chen 수요 도그래서라 딱바 지부 라와서라 딱지 라와chen 다요서라 그 좁다는 배 개심부저셔라 다데 그 매나니 겨와가마도 치마도 타로토에도 용마르시고 건데 이지게지긴지나니 지도도 내가 제도 말을 삼비하라 남바체는 요체되게 내가 제도 그래 요맹게 딱바게 내가 제요 말을 세사비하라 어디에도 가서 그 상계 좀 되겠는데 다도요 말을 쓰소라 뒤인데 참아 할레브르서라 남부 다음에 시기도세 니라 아담아와데 시기라 코라자 다음에 생게마 다음에 마와 세치르바 신다 간가 다 해봐 마와 세치레 다스도 다 딱바치부 라와예게다 풍불레 텐션베다 풍붕아디 벨로가세 다 코라 벨로가 되시 그만 보세븐에 시다 발라내시 군저 개요 말에 그 코라라 대그르 마도시게 그들레 뜻이 될고 말에 풍불레 텐션베다스라 소부제 배 코라 배고 카가레 세부 까부네시 따다 발라내시 배 카가레 마도 코치를 될고에 콜레 뜻이 되고요 말에 풍불레 텐션베다 예시그라 혼자 남부전에 풍부다 미네 미 풍부다 오직버레마도 미 풍부 배하샤는 미다라 두에요 말아 자 딱지 라와sen지 다서래 풍불레 텐션베다 세거리셔라 어째서 요 말도 또 차라요라 단딜이야 랑게투베 제여기 다음에 봐서 오라 랑게투베 제여기 다음에 봐서도 랑게투스는 샬리한테 먹어서 코나란도 통해 또 벽에 날리는 게 저요래 미치 콜레가 지체고요나 콜레가 제가 당시 그 랑게투고 말했어 랑게피고 말 콜로 로봇이 단 마도 그 연구 말했어 그래 랑게피고 말 코나 랑게 받수요도 전다 풍부성활을 때 매고 이제 다 코란데 수요도 그랬어 그래 랑게투베 제여기 다 켈링이라 현다 남부 그때 켈링이 말 랑게투바 제여기다 현다지 풍부성활을 때는 봐다 송고요나 다들 랑게투바 말에 남부에서는 따여라 봐 심장바다 저 제여다 따여 지셔요라 제여스도 코란 왜 송활을 코란 마인게지 잘 애니 공회 송고도는 때 따여서 그래 그나 남부에서는 가사디 따여라 풍부성활을 때는 네 미리 네 딸은 네 발라르스파 따고로 따여래 다 콘주디 치르바네 다 따여서 말에 제여라 최신 소를 때고 말에 코란 카둘 수에 요래 로바신다를 손이 다 마인게지 셈을 차니 다 따고 말에 랑게투베 제여기 따서라 제여다 따여서 지시그래 심장바다도 저 따여서네 코란 뭔지도 최신다지 셈을 차네 아니파 디레스 뭔지 저거도 따여서 거라 제여서네 코란 메소알라 신다 수질 때 뭐가 코란 카둘래 뭔지엔도나 그는 뭐 세보 가루 마르세네시라 카둘 뭔지에 거라 저도 제여서 거라 심장바다 저도 세위다 우마 땡겨서는 한틀 제여기 따도 시험하죠 야 다 단단하죠 계시면서 주로 나네 다음에 봐서 가서 다음에 세대 랑게투베 자유지 다음에 버틀세 거래 이 제다마 도데바 셈잠바 오마 땡겨와 정말 켈레가 투무도 켈레래 투무도 켈레야더라 다 단데 네가 오마 땡겨서나 다음에 봐서 디 투무에 다음에 락바래 일레 트라와데 다 랑윈에 매버셔야 돼 다음에 세도 랑윈에 매버 다 거라 랑궁에 매버 샬라 뜨신데네 샤고 보면도 랑궁에 매버들 다음에 세도 어디 오마 땡겨가 시거라 자 오마 땡겨가서는 동반이 또 그래서 다 랑윈에 매버데 또 그래서 단다 디심이다서 주로 나네 다음에도 랑게투베 자여기 다음에로와 뒤또고 삼비 하루 톱톱이 말해서 동반이 가서 랑원에 매버 동반이 또고 그러마도 랑게투베 자여기 다음에 또고 삼비 하루 톱톱이 말해서 그래 다 지다마도 건조 세게 그래 될래 좋아 대 템버통에 저저기 동예통에 지시자서도 대신에다서 주로 시도자 랑게투베 자여기 다음에 시도도 어디전 현대 될다 집어리지라 뒤통에 들으라 아마도 계란이 때가 동반이 생겨서 라고는 매버 뒤 체다르세 저가가 매세네 시리세 뒤등부도서 어디 저버져라 템바통에 저저 대신부터서 주로 뒤나네 당미대 랑게투베 자여기 다음에 봐 야 고대에서는 풍불에 대신에 다음에 봐 라 딱지 랑화생기 다음에 봐 시스템을 차려서 거로 견주 어디 매버데 겁나 너무 반도를 타로 톱도를 세워라 어디 타로 톱도 말다세 가서 랑원에 맞으면 동반이 또 그러마도 이 타로 톱도 말을 세워라 어디다 이 템바통에 저기 동기통에 지시자세데 수첩에서도 다 발레 제대로니 택바신분들 시진진들 값을 송샤세 시다 건조 시진이 노디 상계가 말해세 이 아주 켈링메세 택바신분들 까 켈링 말와 단대 대선에 따르다 탈렌 버마 도주 택바 멤버 시샤시게 쪽에 택바 신분도 도주 상계가 켈링 말해 고물루르고 서샤르세 니 동반이 도주 체다르스 오기로 랑원에 동바세 랑원에 매네 매라니 가게 맹게 차르세 어디시데 택바 멤버게 죽다마와이네다 어디바다 치다마와다 대속에 어디 동반이 또고 말해세 길랍교래 아니 내게 동반이 또 그래세 가와선도 티진기 너나 송샤세 티진 너가 말해 티세마 말해세 사기 소요 말해세 세요라 어디 저버제니 티진 까투바스 Wo nama tekwa simbo dotu sanje kare es to biora. Wo di tanda yoga che gyasa de masana tishi zatsura. Wo di sona.
So, oh, So here, the essential point that we need to understand, again, we are at this point of in verse 40, where it says liberation is gained from seeing the Four Noble Truths, or seeing the truths. So what is the point of perceiving emptiness? So again, what we need to understand here is that the Buddha presented, again, the Four Noble Truths and these 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths. And these are the same for all Buddhist tenets schools. So here, again, according to non-Buddhists, they assert some kind of a self that is like something which is permanent in the sense of being unchanging, something that is indivisible. It is unitary. There are no parts to it. It's not like, for example, the Buddhists divide, okay, the self can be divided into the 5 aggregates and so forth. You can identify various parts. But this is something that non-Buddhists would not accept. They say this is something that is permanent, unchanging, kind of unitary, and that the self is also sort of able to set itself up. It's autonomous or independent, not reliant or dependent on anything else, not reliant upon even the aggregates. And so here, when it comes to their kind of understanding, these non-Buddhists think that, well, if that kind of self doesn't exist, if there isn't this permanent, unchanging, unitary, autonomous kind of a self, then you couldn't have karma. You couldn't have the committing of actions and then the ripening of results. So here, this is where the Buddha came in and taught the idea of selflessness, of anatman, that there is no such self. It was kind of an amazing thing for the time that someone would teach that there is no such self, as all of the rest of these kinds of schools asserted. And so here, to assert some kind of a self that is like apart from the aggregates, separate from the aggregates, that we could identify in the way that you can identify separately, like yellow and blue, or like a yellow and white, or an ox and a horse. This is something the person can't be established aside from the aggregates. And so here, when it comes to the kind of understanding of selflessness as it is described in those 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths that are commonly accepted by all of these 4 tenet schools, including those which we consider to be of the Theravada or the Hinayana, their understanding of selflessness in terms of this third characteristic of the truth of suffering is selflessness in the sense of there not being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So we have this term self-sufficient, and I mean, this is like, we could use this colloquially of like, you don't need any sort of help. You're able to do it on your own without anything else. And so such a self that is not dependent upon the aggregates in any way, that is sort of substantially existent as opposed to being just designatedly or imputedly existent. So here, a self that has that kind of existence, substantial existence, self-sufficient kind of existence, in the sense that it isn't dependent upon anything else, that sort of self, the lack of that sort of self, is the understanding of selflessness according to those 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths, again, commonly accepted by all of these tenet schools. So here we can get into the kind of understanding of a designated existence, sort of like something being substantially existent in the sense of like, it's right there. It's something that can be directly perceived. We don't have to rely upon anything else to understand it, in the sense where something that is imputedly existent or designatedly existent, we have to have something else arise to mind to then think, oh, self. And so that kind of, what those terms mean can vary slightly between the tenet schools. But here, the sort of common understanding that there is no self of the person that is somehow self-sufficient and substantially existent, in the sense of not being dependent upon anything. That kind of selflessness that is that attribute of the first of the Four Noble Truths is something that the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequentialist middle way school, would understand to be a more coarse kind of understanding. They would assert that that in order to gain any level of liberation, even that of a hearer or a solitary realizer, it's necessary to realize emptiness, meaning that phenomena are not objectively existent. They don't have this kind of like true existence, independent existence from their own side, but rather they are merely designated. And so here for them, just understanding that coarser level of selflessness, the lack of a person's self-sufficient, substantially existent self, is not going to allow you to get to freedom. That is what these Prasangika Madhyamakas, the consequentialist middle way school, understands. But for the lower schools, particularly those that are like Hinayana or Theravada schools, the Vaibhashikas and the Sutra school, they would say, well, why do you need something else? The Buddha taught these 16 attributes of the Four Noble Truths, including selflessness, and the realization of that is sufficient. If you have to realize this lack of objective existence, you actually fall into nihilism. And so for them, they would say that if you go that far, you're falling into total non-existence. You don't need something in addition to this more coarse level of selflessness, or they wouldn't consider it coarse. And therefore, what this comes to then is that where emptiness, in terms of the Prasangika Madhyamaka understanding of emptiness, is taught is in the sutras of the perfection of wisdom, things that did not arise, say, during the time of the Buddha's life. And so here in the Mahayana sutras, we see teachings about the perfection of wisdom, emptiness, this understanding of emptiness as it is posited by the Prasangika school. But these other schools would say, well, that's not the speech of the Buddha. To say that things don't have any objective existence or existence from their own side is falling into saying that nothing is existent whatsoever. And so here, these lower tenant schools, particularly those sort of Hinayana or Theravada schools, say that you don't need emptiness. Actually, the teachings on emptiness are not even valid. They're not the Buddha's speech. This is something that was maybe made up or constructed by Nagarjuna and some of these other masters. And we see this even today. There are differences in terms of what Buddhist schools accept as being the speech of the Buddha. Some would assert that things like the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras are not the Buddha's teachings, whereas others would say, yes, these are definitely the teachings of the Buddha. And not only that, this is the thing that is necessary in order to gain liberation. So here we then turn to this kind of debate that is establishing the validity of the Mahayana scriptures, thus the necessity of emptiness as being the path that leads to liberation. So here I've tried to kind of summarize, Geshe-la says that sometimes he goes in circles, and so tried to summarize the kind of essential points of what this is really getting at in this verse.
Thì là bạn đạt được giải thoát rồi, cần gì phải chứng tính không. Còn họ nói cái tư tưởng mà Đại Thừa nói chứng tính không để được giải thoát, đó tư tưởng của Ngài Long Thọ. Đại Thừa là tư tưởng sau này của Ngài Long Thọ mới chế tạo ra thôi, nó không phải là lời Phật dạy. Cho nên để đây tranh biện rất là lớn, nói Đại Thừa là phải lời Phật dạy hay không.
Tunge shebar cha son son atambo. Tunge le tunge hi bashe kure se son rwa. O di pe cha na son rwa kudi. Ne she cha pe na nga zu na zu na gu yu na. Tunge yon je na zu na ni chi na de yu na. Tambo su su na gu yu da ha ko ra. Su su na gu yu da ha ma ko na ni ke ha. Me ba te ten de sam lo ko ma rwa. Nga zu tunge le tunge hi ba da ha ko na wa de ngo ne kyen ji du sam. Saje Nilenji Pumbuti, Telegram Shinchire, Madu Tipe, Kalikabu Shasam, Tunge Shichigere Shasam, then it Tunge Pagwetaba, Stambu Mida, Tungeni Samlutan, Choake Sona, Roa, Odipe Chane, Sungura. Nene Shesha, Stambu Naza Nagiba Sozu Hakone, O Naza Nagudo, Ditunge, Jure Shasam Hako Sona, Nene Sheshas, Negi Junipanza, and Naza de Jukare Nasam. Oh, that can another Judiritase, Tipangures, no, that another de Juditirito, man, this Savure, Samson Tangira. Nene Shaja Negi Judipanza in Bahakores, Nedi Menduna Nel Nagi Bahakosana, Naza de Nyanga Bahakosana, te Judicari Nasam, oh, that Judipangure, some Gresera. Tunge Shebarja, Kunju Pangbarja, Tunge Jukunju, Nyamota, Nyamo, Sabaleres, te Apanjares of Gora. Nene Sheja, Negi Juni Pansala. The ne Topjas, oh, Negi Judy Pansona, Naza Trani Tewa Yunguresa, Naza Mebe Tewa de Topjares, and then Akura. Naza te Judy Hako, Judy Pana, and then Naza Trabe Tewa de Topgresa. Nene Sheja, Negi Juni Pansala, the ne Topjas. Tewa never did Topjas. Tunge Sheberja, Kunju Pambacham, Gopang want to Cha, said Nyamu Pambe Pambang Gopang went to China, and it to me town to Yora. Nanny she naked by the net of the many them. The net of Jas, Takaricha would have said, Nazata, Yore, Sesuna, Nazata, the Karateva, Yungure, Sesuna, and Tichelia, Tatashi Karcha would say, the Mesa would say, many share, many temperature, dinner should say. And then Tunge, Tunge Bahako, Tunge Jukareti Hako, Tunge di Juda Cheba say over there Hako, Takarcha de Sabatoe, Tashi Karcha, Lamcom Gores, and a Lamde, Shegora. Tunge Juda Timothy, Sheja Pancha, Rigbarchas, Temberchas, Sheja, Tunge Tunge Bashebachi, Sheja Panja, Tunge Junior Mo, in by the Panja and Bahago Chase. Rigbarchas, Tunge Sebe Seba de Toberchaku Res. Tembercha, Tito Balia, Lam de Tangures, Lampagwe, Lamia Javate, Tangure, Comgures, Shivto, all the patients on the Cote Emeritus.
So when the Buddha then taught the Four Noble Truths, he said that we need to know suffering, and he used this example of like illness. We need to know our suffering situation as suffering. We need to recognize it as such in order to wish to be freed from that. So too, if we're sick, if we don't know we're sick, we're not even going to have the thought of going to see a doctor. It's only once we recognize that we are ill, then we are going to try to find a remedy for that. So if we hold this sort of suffering situation to be happiness, then we won't see it as a problem. We're not going to make any kind of an effort to get out of it until we know that we are experiencing suffering, that the situation we have is suffering. So first we need to know suffering and then recognize the kind of cause of suffering. Is there a way to get rid of this suffering that we're experiencing? So this then is like when we seek out the cause of an illness. What is it that is getting us sick? How do we get rid of it? Is it something that we can get rid of? And so by identifying the cause, we're then able to abandon it. So as the Buddha said with the first truth, no suffering, we then abandon the cause of suffering. So what we are trying to get to, the object that we are trying to attain, like as if we were sick, is a state of happiness, free from that suffering of illness. And we have to see that that is something that is possible. So here, then, we should try to obtain, to actualize that state of health, that state of happiness. And we do so through a particular method. So in the case of an illness, we have to find the kind of right medicine to take to make ourselves well. And so too, when we look at the kind of Four Noble Truths, we see that, well, we need to first recognize that it's possible to extinguish the suffering that we have through the right kind of methods. So by knowing suffering, by abandoning its causes, we are then able to obtain, to actualize the truth of suffering by relying on the path, by practicing the path. So this is the sort of way that we should understand the Four Noble Truths. It's like being sick, and we first have to recognize that we're sick, know that we're sick, know that we're suffering, abandon the cause, obtain that cessation by relying on a path.
Nyamu pang be pang bang, nyamu gokbe ngokpa de thoba che gore, gokpa ngondo cha. Ni ting gokpa thobe tanda karjo lam kombar cha. Phagbe lam yala jeba de kom gore se. Ni gokpa thop to gore so budwa. O di chi so na.
So in the sutra, the Buddha has said that we should know suffering, and knowing suffering, we then strive to abandon the cause, get rid of or eliminate the cause of that suffering. And we try to actualize, to obtain the cessation from that suffering by meditating on the path. So for the sake of obtaining that cessation, we meditate on the sort of eightfold right path, the correct path. And this is the way in which we are able to actualize that cessation. So this is how the Buddha has summarized it.
Là muốn đạt được diệt đế thì chúng ta phải đoạn trừ phiền não. Mà đoạn trừ phiền não bằng phương pháp nào? Phương pháp đó là đạo đế cần phải nâng tu.
Đó 팔람야라 제들을 장가시켰지 생각하고도. 팔람야라 제들이다. 람kom구레스도 박벨람야라 제들 kom구레스로. 이 담부데 가르스는 양덕배 따와서로 양덕배 따와서. 근데 가르스는 강사 란게트베 제유지 담이데 지다와신도로. 강사 란게트베 제유지 동바데 란게트베 제유지 담에베 강사가 담에데 마노라 최신도 양덕바 또 그래스. 양덕바 삼루탄게 또 버들 양덕배 따와서 그거라. 어디지 소나야.
Nên đạo nên tu.
So then we have this sort of Arya eightfold path. So here, these are the paths, what we are training in to then get the sort of attain that cessation. So the first of these is correct view, and correct view is here referring to unmistakably knowing the selflessness in the sense of lacking a self-sufficient, substantially existent self.
Cái thứ hai là chánh tư duy.
So and then the sort of the next of these in the eightfold path, based upon our sort of correct reasoning and analysis, then one comes to sort of determine the correct view through that kind of investigation. So here, this is the second of the eightfold path.
Tư duy chân chánh là quan sát và như thật về cái không có một cái cá thể nhân vô nghĩa đó thì.
So this is sort of like correct realization or correct understanding is sometimes how it's translated.
양다베 따와도 시한라 뜸벌 제바다 다티선에 메다고 뜸벌 소강가 양식으라 양다베 따와도 시한라 뜸벌 제바다 제 참마 치주 낙셀라 소바 나게 견강가 매베 나들이야 빵베 나들이야 네 양다베 나시거라.
Cái thứ ba là chánh ngữ. Chánh ngữ
So
là
then we have correct speech. So again, the translations of these, the previous was correct realization, like coming to understand that selflessness of the person or sometimes suchness through our investigation. And then there is correct speech, which is sort of teaching to others the correct view and not having any sort of defects of speech like lying or so forth.
Luigi kone so cheba machine lemba loyim la soba any meki wa to pangbe luigi cheba telia any yanda be yanda be leji tasikora luigi le number ta ta da so cheba machine loyim la soba tinde be chebe luigi le telia yanda be leji tasikora do
So, and then there is like a right conduct. So here, this is referring to, it's like it really sort of like the edge of action. So this is referring to that one is acting with one's body in particular, acting in a pure way, no killing, no sexual misconduct, no stealing.
Yanda be choa de mezike ga chajin de susu lega che pesha sa wa tende ma do so che ba la so bo da milin go go ta ye ta ro mili chawa che ne tu ye ta tende che ne lo be choa cha ga da teni rab du chwa de che ne yang shen la lia chen da to la kha khe ba she che kha se da shong lo se de Koran de ba che be su te ne te ma do pa khe ba she che o nga chi 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 ya bu che so Kepe yabu chung song se, kul yabu roba chewen dong do, kinti che yorwa, tesu chowa de kena de yabu chi ke wora, rabdu chunga ina, sudab de. Kimba ina ko tikpa de mandi ba, lungbu che ina lungbu che jab ma da, che ma jiwa chen de tien ju yuwa ma, ti tikpa chimbo yung gor da. Te, namji nganzu, pwede ba ina, shungi re si de, Komba chiba ga chala resu de keshambu chigra odi yabu chala de komba chiba ga chala re da sigre kato ba ngazu chule chade ti chiba ga chala re ke yo mare sikwa ngune chene chiba ga chala de komba chik chikire na pena shungi ari shungi komba re chikche komba chikche matavini ya komba chik shungi chane su sebe ina Mi tanga kaze yuna ti tanga nyambe komurere sebe tikwa yungora. Shiba di kolo wangen di mi mambu yungora, mi kanga wangi yungora. Tile mi chik sane komu chik kui na, komu chik kui ba kya shora mato shima marwa. Ta tsokpa rabzi yuna tsokpa tilo wangen kaze yuna tire. Kegab dachini kegab tilo wangen mi kaze yuna, komu chik sosolo majimba lambar china, mi tanga nyambe ti tikwa yungora. Tikwa chere te. Yana puwa dede a shungri kayo marase, kirang baguna ne tego marase kre. Kirangi baguna ne tego mare, shungri kariyo re se sulu shigdwa. Nguma puwa dwa ni chiba rida se de shinachiru, odi chiba rida se, kumpa chiba chala rida se de, sosolo mangu rije saso chigira. Sa di tiba cheyo rida, oti di. Tanda ta soso chowa kaya de, soso lega che kale kemche suna yangdagwa chowa re. Team members mel go ta kabli kyab chene chi so che mero ba sheji chene tinde chene so kere na ni ti bo chem jora lobe so asigara sudab de message ke de or ti yang dag ba so adi chigra ya
So then is right livelihood. And so here, this is really referring to the way in which we sustain ourselves. We need to engage in things in order to survive, but we shouldn't do things that are harmful, that are really engaging in non-virtuous activities or that are like stealing from others or any other thing to try to just sustain ourselves. So here we need to do, we need to have enough to survive, but we shouldn't do so so through non-virtuous means. And in particular, for those who are ordained, there are particular types of wrong livelihood, like say going to one donor and saying like, oh, well, this other donor gave me all of this money, and trying to like through flattery or through other types of wrong means. Those are not the ways in which we should try to sustain ourselves. So here, when it comes to our understanding of sort of right livelihood, we should also recognize that like when we take something that is common property, this is really a grave misdeed. Like previously in Tibet, it was if something was seen as being like the common property of a monastery, people were very careful. They didn't want to be seen as stealing from the monastery and so forth. But maybe when it came to like something belonging to the government, especially like nowadays, people might think, oh, well, that like whatever, it doesn't really matter. It's not really any money, like it's not really important, or they might just be sort of dismissive of that. If we don't pay, for example, our taxes, and we are withholding even like $1 from the government, that's not just like the government is a non-entity, but rather it's all of the people that live under that government are really the owners of that. So it's not just that we're taking $1, but we're taking $1 from each of those people who are the collective owners of this thing, or the collective debtor, like the ones to whom we owe. And so here we shouldn't sort of think little of that, like, oh, it's just common property, it's not really that important or something like that, because when we take those things or we get them by wrong means, it is quite a grave misdeed, especially if it is a common thing that is owned by many people. So like being sort of taking things from common property, like from the temple or from society even, is quite a dangerous practice to engage in. So we shouldn't think of sustaining ourselves through these kinds of improper means. Those are wrong livelihoods. We shouldn't kill or engage in any other kinds of non-virtues in order to sustain ourselves and to survive. In particular, not those kinds of wrong livelihood for those who are ordained as well.
Tại vì nếu mình xâm phạm tài sản chung của cộng đồng, của quốc gia, của một cái tập thể, thì cái tội nó lớn rất là nặng so với mình trộm của một cá nhân. Nên làm thế nào chúng ta phải có một cuộc sống chánh mạng, sinh sống một cách chân chánh, là không sát sinh, không dối gạt, là cái phương pháp sống của mình làm sao cho nó không tổn hại đến người.
Vậy cho sự đi liên ngay như xung là số bảo vệ cái rồi anh ấy chơi mà bảo tôi cho phải cái cho chơi thật sự chơi chân đi chơi thì gọi là chơi bằng chơi tôi nghe mà bằng tôi yang đã bảo bằng tôi thì chơi làm mà bằng cái bảo tôi thì bằng cái chuyện gì cho chơi thì gọi là ở đây yang đã bảo cho chơi là.
And then there is a right effort, and right effort so here right effort is referring to the kind of resolve. Again, when we think about like joyous effort, this is having a kind of joy in virtue. And here, this is really recognizing the kind of faults, the negativities of our body, speech, and mind, and making an effort, having that joyous effort to overcome and remove all of those faults is right effort.
Yang tu betul yang tak bertambah asyik tu. Oh, di kaya ni palam yang lah kaya asyik ada. Ya.
Yang tak bertinggi jing. Di dun rồi. So, and then we have a sort of right mindfulness, which again is keeping in mind the sort of practices that we are making effort at, or keeping in mind the proper view, that understanding of selflessness in the sense of a person's lack of being a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and so forth. So keeping those things in mind is right mindfulness. Di duma to yomare.
đó tông ba nhị tộc về xí đẹp thì rồi tông ba nhị tộc về xí đẹp thì anh ấy xí bà lệ trâu xí bà làm được trâu bà xí đó tông mà thiên chúa cái trâu cái gọi đó tông ba nhị ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba thì to nó mà đó xí bà lệ trâu thu mà đấy sẽ ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba càng sa ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba tộc về làm được xí bà lệ trâu sẽ cái làm đấy sẽ tại cái thu mua chịu ba ràng cái thu về sẽ gì ta mấy bà tộc vào xăm đi xí bà lệ trâu thu mà đấy sẽ ràng nguyên trâu về ta mấy bà tộc vào đấy sẽ cái xí bà lệ trâu sẽ cái làm đấy sẽ cái đó càng sẽ luôn lệ làm đến này mấy bà sang chú mấy bà sống sẽ đó thế qua xem về xe rồi chỉ phải được xem về luôn cái nào liền tông ba nhỉ ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba càng sa ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba chơi ràng nguyên trâu về tông ba thì tộc về làm đến mấy na anh ấy nhận được cái change ràng cái change thế chính cái change càng thâu mà rồi sống sao sẽ ra càng sẽ luôn lệ làm đến này mấy bà sang chú mấy bà sống sẽ thì sẽ đó thế là nè ya ở đây chỉ sống sao tạm bộ thứ ba nhỉ đấy
Dạ, cái tinh tấn chánh thứ tư thứ 8 là chánh định.
So here then turning, I think we may have forgotten one of the 8, but I'll set that aside. So then turning to the text here, it's establishing that the path that frees one from samsara is this wisdom realizing emptiness. And so here, in order to establish that, again, we are establishing that the scriptures of particularly the perfection of wisdom scriptures which teach this kind of the emptiness as understood by the prasangika madhyamakas, meaning that emptiness of a kind of objective existence. This realization being necessary for liberation, any level of liberation, the enlightenment of a hearer, a solitary realizer, or a Buddha, is the assertion of the prasangika madhyamakas. And they are saying that this is what is taught in the scriptures, that without this realization of emptiness, that one is not able to achieve any level of spiritual liberation. So here in the second half of verse 40, it reads, the scriptures state that there is no spiritual awakening without this path, that it is necessary to meditate on emptiness.
this was a dinner sooner. Dick came and this and you so mares, Sama mares, Shagora. Teaching Teguachambu so to the Sanje Kamatuse, Kamares, the Sama Marakel and the Digmares, Gora. Get the teaching Madruna, Kurgi Loni, Chidatruse. Kirang is teaching, shaging in the Lona, so shazing all the Chuchikubiore. Teaching in London to Kanga Sanje Kamarese. ngala tuku me do sara ke tiji madrub na kege longde chida tuse kera longge ene ngala ya tongba ni to ko ba tharba thoba la tongba ni to ko ba de kan strup tu ma re se gora ke de tiji madrub na kege longde chida tuse ene tila gudo ya ti sona.
So here then those kind of Hinayana schools, or those lower tenant schools, raise the objection again, saying that well, you're citing your scriptures to say that this is necessary, this realization of emptiness is necessary for spiritual awakening, but we say that these are not the teachings of the Buddha. These are not established as valid scriptures of the Buddha. So in the first part of 41, it says then, now it may be argued by Hinayanists that the Mahayana scriptures are not established as the Buddha's teachings. And so then the sort of rebuttal to that is, well, then on what grounds is your own Hinayana canon so established? So here, again, the sort of lower tenant schools are asserting that it's not established for them that those, like the perfection of wisdom scriptures, are the speech of the Buddha. So we can't accept that kind of scriptural validation because we don't accept those scriptures as valid.
Đại thừa là
And so then I guess there's also the rebuttal then to this, saying like sort of the response saying, well, then on what grounds are your scriptures established as being valid?
Kanshi niga ladub des, tatsu lenja wada, teta tengme dotosu da, kirangi kaya ba kaya lingi towa, nga zuyo kaya ba kaya lingi, teta yongda re, soba kaya yoma res. Tekwa chimbe dotosu, kirangi kaya lingi na, nga zuyo, tekwa meba ka tukta mawa da tezo, kaya lingi me esera. Sanji ka sung yoma res, kaya yoma ra. Sanji tekwa chimbe to yongda chini sung me re. Chidang di tenpa shile soba yongda chi sung rwa. Tekwa chenpo yongda che soni me kanga Thabkhe shen cheba chegure songura susule shenda lawa chegure sani me nawa dhugu marwa wangbu nambu dhawu se nyingduk chenpo tende ni songura tongpa nyesi rangwa ne tongpa re sidi taa de shida zugu tsusa me geri ji pungbu la tene pa Thabkhe tsam re ma to rangwa du korang chi yuwa ma re ma yinga tende chi tsu sonen tele lung Thabkhe pa taa shada ti lega chidi taa ke lega che se milam dhawu gyuma dhawu re ma to ngarazu thon na shi temba mare se sungurwa tezu kangal suni kabure kazu ngazu chunju dale dudwa da shendo chechawa sawe tamba chebar chas da shen chewe se tezu sawa chebure mi kangal she mare chera lotu chimbu ningdu chimbu tendele ya she bure ma to sudawa do marwa chezo tekwa chimbu te tongba ni da Thabkhe shen chebu to yongda chen sungurwa mare sanje techo ombu nombu pe sawarib cheche sungurwa 제자 그 용자제 매도 따디 상계 까마르세 똑바 용구르와 어디지 손안이 돼서 같이 니가 라도 돼서 내 택면 도서도 계란게 캘링그리 티진바 캘링그 가져 참아야 캘링 니가 캘링그리 와서 거라 돼서도 참아르서 야 어디 비자지 인디스
So the back and forth here then again, so the Hinayanists say, well, these Mahayana scriptures are not established by us as valid. We don't accept them as being valid. So the response from the Prasangikas, the Madhyamikas, is like, well, in what case, in that case, then on what grounds are your own Hinayana canon, your own Hinayana scriptures established? And so the Hinayanist responds that, well, because it is granted authenticity by both of us, as in we both accept these commonly sort of accepted, widely taught teachings of the Buddha. We both accept them, and so therefore they are valid. We don't need to have any sort of dispute about that. But when it comes to these teachings that were not sort of widely taught, that were, for example, the Buddha did not teach like the exchange of self and other, or the lack of there being a kind of objectively existent self, that there is only merely a self that is designated on a basis of designation, but it doesn't have this kind of objective, real, true existence from its own side. So that is something that not all disciples would be able to understand. And so therefore the Buddha didn't teach these things widely, or like, for example, the practice of exchanging self and other. That is not something that all types of people are able to practice. And so therefore, like Shantideva says earlier in this text, the exchange of our self-cherishing attitude for cherishing others is something that should be done in secret. We don't sort of broadcast that to others because it's not something that they can really understand. And so here, the Mahayanists would sort of respond that, well, these teachings were not widely spread sort of to everybody, but that doesn't mean that they are not authentic. So the Hinayana here, just stopping with this sort of point of the argument of the Hinayanas, they would say that, well, because we both accept these Hinayana scriptures of the Buddha as being valid, then we can accept them as being valid. But I don't accept your Mahayana scriptures as valid. Therefore, they're not valid. And that's where we will kind of stop with the argument.
Có một cái sự đại lực, cái tâm rất là lớn, nên họ mới theo quan điểm của Đại thừa, họ mới có thể tiếp nhận được tư tưởng Đại thừa. Tại vì Đức Phật không dạy phổ biến cho tất cả mọi người, cho nên có sợ một người họ không nghe được kinh Đại thừa nên họ nghi ngờ rằng họ nói là kinh Đại thừa không phải là lời Phật dạy. Cho nên kinh điển, họ nói là kinh điển tiểu thừa là kinh điển, tại vì cả tiểu thừa và đại thừa đều chấp nhận, cho nên kinh điển đó là kinh điển hợp như là đúng tiêu chuẩn và hợp lệ, vì những cái nhận thức có giá trị. Nên đó là cái lý luận của những người mà cho rằng không chấp nhận kinh đại thừa.
Oh yeah, that is. Oh yeah.
So we'll stop there for today.
My brothers and sisters, our class is going to stop here today. So our next class is going to be on Sunday evening from 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. Central Time. And now let's recite the short mandala offering and dedicate our merits prayers together. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, all continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as the Buddha's field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Mặt đất này được trang nghiêm với dầu thơm và trải đầy hoa, tô điểm với núi Tu Di, tứ đại bộ châu, mặt trời và mặt trăng. Con tưởng tượng nơi đây là cõi Phật và xin cúng dường. Nguyện tất cả chúng sinh được an hưởng cõi tịnh độ này. Sa di phô kinh trước sinh mê tô trang, ri rạp linh di ni đề ngàn ba đi, sang ghê sinh đu mi tiêu hoa yi, đồ cưng nam đa sinh la châu pha châu. Idam Guru Ratnam Mandalakam Niryataya. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. Nhờ nương công đức các thiện hạnh này, nguyện con sớm thành tựu quả vị của Đức Phật Bổn Sư và dẫn dắt tất cả chúng sinh không trừ sót một ai vào quả vị giác ngộ. Về hoa đi nu đường đàng lama sa ge ru chu ne rồi hoa chi càng mai pa để sa la go pa show. May the supreme jewel Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminished but increase more and more. Nguyện cho ngọc quý tối cao Bồ Đề Tâm, nơi nào chưa phát triển, sẽ nảy sinh lớn mạnh, nơi nào đã phát triển, sẽ tăng trưởng không giảm, mà tăng thêm mãi mãi. Trần trực sâm chô, rinh bác mã ghi bà kê chô, kê hoa nam ba, mê bác May we dedicate these merits to all mother sentient beings, including ourselves and others. May we all complete the Buddha path and attain the Buddhahood. Nguyện năm công đức này khắp tất con đệ tử và chúng sinh đều trở thành Phật đạo. Thank you, Pandita. Thank you, Geshe-la. Thank you, Geshe-ma. Thank you, Ms.Katrina Brooks. Yeah, have a good night. Good night, Pandita.
Oh yeah.